Okay. But let's try.
All right. We're going to pick up our discussion we started last week. So I started last week by reviewing kind of the essence of an article and kind of added some of my own thoughts to I think round out the idea that was being presented. I sent out that article over the email in case you read it. And so if you weren't here last week, you didn't listen to the class, or you didn't see the article, the essence of it, it's raising the question, why are some people deconstructing their faith? And the gist of the article is say, first, don't panic. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's basically you're having to reevaluate. You're critically thinking, what about this faith I've been given? And you've got to examine it, and you've got to somehow, tease it apart, and then hopefully reconstruct it. The whole idea is you deconstruct it to reconstruct it. Doesn't mean everyone does. Some people just deconstruct it and sit there with all the pieces. But often what we do is we critique it, we examine it, we pull it apart, we look at all of it, and then we start trying to put something back together. So how then will I make this faith my own? And so the article was about that, and it was specifically it was geared more to old guys like me trying to understand why younger people are doing it, because probably a lot of old guys like me think this is the worst thing ever. Why can't they just keep it the way we had it? But the reality is, I was one of those young kids at one time too, and I was questioning everything my professors were saying when I was going to college, and I was questioning what my parents had taught me and trying to figure it out for myself. What of this did I believe, and what of it didn't I believe? Right? So it's not limited to one generation. It's not even limited to young people. I would hope, my hope is all of us are right now still deconstructing and reconstructing. Because as soon as you deconstruct and reconstruct, what you reconstruct needs to be critically examined. Once you rebuild something, it still needs to be looked at again and go, well, what did I rebuild here? Because I guarantee you, whatever we rebuild is not perfect. It needs to be examined. And we shouldn't be offended if someone else examines it either, right? That doesn't mean they're trying to tear everything down and ruin everything. And maybe it's my baby because I reconstructed it, and I'm a little offended that they want to ask hard questions like, I don't know, Greg, is that faith really the faith that I need to hold? I don't need to take offense. I need to say, good. You look at it. You decide for yourself, how does this speak to you as a faith, as a framework? So there were 5 general reasons. I went through those. I'll just go over them real quick without comment. This is things the article suggested. Trust in large institutions is declining across the board. That's government, business, media, church, everything. So a lot of people are questioning the big, the corporate, the ginormous. It's all impersonal, it's money driven, and the church is certainly often acted in ways to look just like that, with its own scandals, right? Second one was, we live in a more diverse, accessible, and mobile world, which means you hear now ideas. Years ago, you might not be exposed to ideas. Now it's easy to get on the internet and be exposed to a whole range of ideas, which then can raise questions, right? The third one was that some Christians, that this person called high performing, they work really hard, they've been really dedicated because they think the church is worth, the institutional church is worth saving. They kind of get to a point where that's not worth saving. I'm tired of trying. I've tried really hard. So they burn out. That's what this person said. A fourth one was the prideful prioritization of conformity over unity. And the author was talking about that the whole breadth of Christian experience and teaching addresses every single question anyone could possibly have. I mean, in 2,000 years, every question, every doubt has been raised and discussed. But sometimes a particular church doesn't want anyone to look outside their own little denominational borders, right? And when in fact there could be Christians from another, perhaps different denomination, but have wrestled with this issue. But rather than letting people with questions look there, they kind of stay within the bounds of what we're discussing. And so it's kind of a prideful prioritization of conformity to our group rather than you got a question. I can put, here's an author. I know he's not from our church and from our denomination, but he addresses it. Here's a discussion. Right? So he gave that as a reason. And the fifth one was his opinion, the acceptance of political idolatry and conspiracy theories in Christian communities has led to some people being disillusioned with what are the priorities here? I thought it was Jesus and the gospel. Is it not? And that's leading to their deconstruction. Okay, so those were the 5 that were given. And I wanted to talk about today and get our input collectively is, so how do we respond to this? And I reread the article carefully, looking to see if the author gave any recommendations. I really could only find one explicit recommendation. Before the author started listing the 5 reasons he found that people are deconstructing, he made one a very clear recommendation. He said, it's essential for the church to open up space for the skeptics, doubters, and misfits. Yeah. Right? So that was the one explicit recommendation. It's essential for the church to open up space for the skeptics, doubters, and misfits.
Check, misfits.
Huh? Yeah. Yeah. So DF can stand for dysfunctional fellowship as well as disciples fellowship. Or as some of you know, Stanley Autry, he referred to the Christmas show, the Island of Misfit Toys. That's what he compared us to. We're the Island of Misfit Toys.
Amen.
So, but the thing is, the article doesn't elaborate. So I'm inviting us to elaborate. How do you create space for the skeptics, the doubters, and the misfits? There's one thing to say create space. What does that mean? How do you do that? What does that look like?
So how do you end up in the jungle?
Yeah, following Jim Jones and Diane. Okay.
You know, one of the things that I think back when I first started deconstructing a bit and talking to certain people, the general reaction was fear that I was asking the question. And so that's my thought, I guess, first is, don't be afraid. Somebody tells you they're thinking something different from the norm, what I think, whatever.
Okay.
Accept that that's where they are and have a discussion.
Okay. Let's start with that one. I think the way we as a community respond to someone who's skeptical, doubting, or raising a question is, I agree, absolutely key. Because my experience was the first institution of higher learning that I attended, which will go unnamed. I would raise questions, and it was like beads of sweat broke out on the professor's forehead. Really, really uncomfortable. Which is like throwing red meat to a 20-year-old.
Yeah.
Because now I'm really like, what, are you afraid? You're obviously afraid of my question. And now that you've shown your fear, I'm really wanting to know why. What's so scary about me saying, well, I don't know. And they start getting nervous. The second institution of higher learning that I attended, Christian professors, I couldn't get them to break a sweat no matter what. They sat there and they're like, we've heard it all before. A friend of mine had invited some Jehovah's Witnesses in to it, and they convinced him that maybe Jesus, maybe the Trinity whole idea is wrong, you know, and that Jesus is a lesser God. And so he shared this with myself and another friend, and we're like, that's yeah. So we got a guy named Bill Gresham who had his doctorate from Edinburgh, Scotland. We sat down in his living room and said, okay, here's the problem. We're worried about Tommy. It's really his name, our friend, because he's had some Jehovah's Witnesses, and he no longer thinks maybe Jesus isn't, co-equal with the Father. And Bill Gresham, without a bit of preparation, starts rolling out passage after passage and reason after reason, completely calm, and just astounded us with all the things that he shared about why that was an erroneous way to think about Christ. But the thing was, he didn't panic, right? He was cool. He entertained the question as legitimate, and then he just started helping us think through it. And Tommy think through why maybe that wasn't such a good position. So I think that's key. Now we got to take that to heart, because it's one thing if your child asks me a question. It's a different thing if your child asks you. I'm fine with your children deconstructing, but when my children are deconstructing, right, it can get a little more edgy, right? So this is key, to remain calm, to not panic. Right? I think that's key. Right? It's key. It's like, good question. Okay.
Remember that God's big enough. I mean, we think we have to get God's big enough to handle these problems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we remember that again, this has happened every generation since the beginning of the church. People have asked questions. So it's happened, and yeah, God's big enough to handle it. So we just need to relax and not be uptight. Carolyn, you also.
Yeah, what you're describing is a safe place.
Yeah.
It's a safe place, and people know that they're not going to be taught down to X. They were thrown out. They're just there, breathing, thinking.
Right. No, I you're describing it well. When a person raises it, a question, well, I'm not sure that I really believe that the miracles in the Gospels, I mean, walking on water, I don't know. I don't need to panic. I need to push back instantly and say, you've got to believe, like it's got to be a safe environment, a community where that question can be raised. You're not jumped on, you're not talked down to, you're not instantly like, we need an intervention here. It's like, okay, that's a legitimate question. All right. Other thoughts?
To some extent, being afraid, it's sort of either learned or something. It could be a knee-jerk reaction. And so that if somebody says something, and when we feel that fear, I guess we have to kind of bring that into question ourselves. Just be honest and say, yeah, it scares me, but it's allowed, or it's good. It's being brought up.
Yeah. If you could say, well, something like you're saying, where it's more confessional side. Well, I've never thought of that, and that's kind of disconcerting to me. But I can see because here's what I would suggest, because I break this down, right? He's saying create this space, an environment. To me, is allow the question to be asked, but also affirm it. Actively affirm it. Good question. I can see how you're thinking that, right? Instead of instantly pushing back and saying, no, you can't think that. It is a good question because they asked it. If they're thinking it, it's a good question. I am a believer in the kind of thing, there are no bad questions. There are no bad questions. Because if you're thinking it, it's a good question and it needs to be asked. So not only
There's no bad questions, there's just bad people.
yeah, there's troublemakers, right? You're stirring up trouble by asking your question.
There's this, when you come across these things that
candles, and all this other stuff. that- You know, there's those that may try to deconstruct. Try to understand it. Then there's others that are just doing the Monty Python thing and running away.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a relationship between them. So I would like to find a different interpretation of the running away and how to bring them back to the question versus just running.
I don't really know. Yeah, one of the things we're gonna have to accept in this whole process is we are not in control. And this challenges your belief in the working of the Holy Spirit. We're talking about people getting nervous when questions are asked. I think often what is lacking is a confidence in the working of the Holy Spirit. Right? If you have confidence that the Holy Spirit truly fills us and is working within us, convicting us, leading us, guiding, then when someone else asks a question, I don't need to panic. Like it's on me to somehow stop or change or convict. No, I just need to trust God's at work, His Spirit's at work here. If I have that mentality, I can be a lot calmer, and therefore, when they ask a question, even affirm it. Like, that's a good question. Instead of feeling that I've got to push back on this right now, right? Because like Dave said, what's that indicated me? What am I afraid of that's motivating me that I'm uncomfortable with their question? I need to back up and say, but God's big enough for this. God has dealt with this through 2,000 years in the church. So I think that's part of it. But I don't know that we can't. We can be available. We can create the atmosphere in which people can raise questions, not get jumped on, not get criticized. They can voice it. They don't feel belittled. They don't get marked with a scarlet letter, like S for skeptic, or D for doubter.
Yes, for Senate.
Yeah, S for sinner. You're sitting, you have that way, right? So we can create that environment, but we're just gonna have to trust God working through the process. Then we will be less anxious. And if we are less anxious, we will do better in our response. You know the difference between responding and reacting, right?
Yeah.
Psychologically, reacting is more from the reptilian brain, fight or flight. See, the problem is when their question taps into my reptilian brain, then I'm going to fight or flight. But a response is a more measured, thoughtful way of coming to the situation. I don't want to use reacting because we're saying responding and reacting are two different things. Right? Fight or flight is a reactionary thing. It's instantaneous. It's a surviving thing. Responding is let me think about it for a while. And let me ponder. And then let me see what I might share. But one's slow and one's fast. That's the big difference. We want to be the people who approach it slowly rather than quickly.
when my brain damage stuff, when I do a little bit of sort of a name it, claim it kind of theology. So it shattered everything.
Doesn't work anymore.
God blew it, and so I started on this quest, like, how do I have faith in this, and I would, anytime anybody would come to town, that had been through any kind of, problem, would go and I'd ask them questions, and they never had an answer. It was always, just have faith. And then Johnny Erickson came to town. And I remember I went up to talk to her. I remember standing in line, and people came up and they said stupid things to her like, pray and you'll get better, and she was so gracious, and I stood there and listened to her. And when I got to her, I didn't have any questions because I knew that real faith could survive in hardship and tragedy. So, sort of an answer to that question is the way we live solves that problem. In other words, as people see us, it's not always what we say, it's how we live out our faith.
Right.
Have to give up control.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to get out of control. And the story I was sharing, the reason in the second institution of higher learning, my questions didn't go away. The fact that they handled them without anxiety made kind of the questions not as important. When people were anxious about them and break down in sweat, I wanted to drill down because I'm like, what are you hiding? You're hiding something. You're scared of something. But when they sat there, I'm like, yeah, good question. There aren't really a lot of good answers, but I can give you a kind of some possibilities. But all of a sudden it was like, well, maybe I saw them saying, I don't have all this worked out, and yet I live by faith. And I started realizing maybe I don't have to work all this out either. Maybe I can live with some ambiguity. Right? That makes sense? Because the first place I was being told, or at least I was hearing, there's always a difference. I thought I was being told, who knows what they were saying, but in my young years, it sounded like they were saying, we have absolute evidence for everything we believe. Faith is the basis of logical reason and bona fide, reliable facts. And that when I would drill down on that, they seemed to shuffle their feet. But I'm thinking, but you're the one who's telling me I can have really solid answers for everything. The second place I went, they said, no, there's some things we don't have good solid answers for, but historically, there's been 3 different approaches to the issue.
Isn't it nice when they don't have to be answered?
Yeah, see, and that's exactly what won me over was not someone claiming to have all the answers, but someone admitting this is a tough question. There's an array of possibilities here that learned people, Christian people have wrestled with, and you could look at it this way or this way or that way. And yet this person, it wasn't causing a crisis in their faith. They're people of faith. And it started by example showing me I don't have to have answers for everything to be a Christian. I can actually live by faith, and there can be questions that none of us have the absolute answer for. There's mystery.
Answers change.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's exactly what you're saying. The questions became less important, not because they were answered, but because someone showed me you don't have to have hard, fast answers for everything. And you can still be a person of faith.
To Ken's point, your experience, I think people run away because they feel the person is trying to be a judge. And we're told not to judge. And the second
Yeah.
school, the school, they were more collaborators.
Yeah.
Judges or whatever role you want to kind of put them in, but they weren't putting you. I know, the same thing's true with your relationship with your kids and parents. My mom's 86 years old, and I still think she's on the 14-year-old. When certain things happen, she kind of, defaults into that mom. Well, it's that 14-year-old smart out. Some of it is smart out. Well, I'm supposed to be fun.
We snickered inwardly.
But it is. I think nobody wants to be judged.
Yeah.
If you're feeling that you are being judged, then that's it. I know with my kids.
Yeah.
I really tried to turn to more the collaborating coach, not the therapist judge.
Yeah, Keith?
When you deconstruct, to me, that means, I may be wrong, you have to reconstruct.
Yeah.
So is this the answer to reconstructing? I mean, how do you get a definitive path forward? Does this author address that anywhere?
He does it, and that's kind of why I'm starting to add some things about, that's where I'm headed ultimately, right? So his thing is just identifying 5 problems, saying, don't panic, it's not the worst thing in the world, in fact, it can be good. Just let people, that's all he's doing, and he's giving 5 reasons, and I think there's more than those, right? But what I think, if someone's going to reconstruct, it will be because there was non-judgmental listening. Because if that happens, then the message becomes, you can't ask those questions here. And eventually they're like, well, I guess I just, and then they may say, well, that's just the church in general. That's the church is in total. The church is closed-minded. They've got their holy book. It's got all the answers, and they're not willing to listen to someone who thinks. You can run across any number of people who concluded that. So what we want to do as a community is never let that be the message, that the response they encounter when they say, well, I don't know about that. Then it needs to be a non-judgmental. So here's the points I've listed. Non-judgmental listening, which is that whole thing is I don't jump on them. I don't tell them instantly, that's wrong. You can't think that you're headed off down a trail that'll lead you to damnation. Yeah, don't need to go there. Don't need to go there. So non-judgmental listening, I would say, and affirm the validity. I recently came across this concept, and I think it's wonderfully true. We all say, well, we're human. That means we're not infallible. And we usually mean we're not infallibly right. It's impossible to be fully and totally right. But the converse is also true. Because we're not infallible, no human is infallibly wrong. Think about that for a moment. If that's true, that we are, as finite beings, we cannot be infallible. We are neither capable of being infallibly right, nor capable of being infallibly wrong. So that puts me in the mindset, and I believe that, I love that because I think that's true. That puts me in the mindset of thinking, now, what this person may be saying, or the question they're raising, has got a lot of issues with it that I can see, but you know what? They're not infallibly wrong. There's something true about the question they're raising. If nothing else, it's a true sentiment. It's a true issue for them. But they also might be true. You know, they might be saying something I don't want to hear about some of the flaws in the way I'm practicing Christianity. And I need to be humble enough to say, there's a point there. You know, we haven't been like Jesus, right? Right? So when their skepticism has got a kernel of truth, I need to acknowledge that. I need to affirm the validity of the question, and I need to affirm anything they're saying that's true. Well, the church is hypocritical. No, it's not. Don't go there.
Yeah.
It is hypocritical. Let's just confess. The church is hypocritical.
Or acknowledge that I'm reacting to that, in whatever way I'm reacting to it, and why am I doing it?
Yeah.
Why am I defensive about that?
Yeah, why am I defensive? So one of my points is affirm the validity, and then I say, confess the mistakes, don't defend and excuse. So someone says, I don't want to be a Christian. Christians are responsible for wars and the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and closed-mindedness. And you're going to argue with that, or are you just going to say you're right? Christians did those things. Absolutely. And they were dead wrong when they did them. But I'm not defending that. Well, the Spanish Inquisition wasn't that bad. I actually heard someone say,
Nobody expects.
yeah, I actually heard someone say burning a person at the stake wasn't that bad because they actually smothered from the smoke before the flames actually got to them. Well, that's not putting a nice little bow on that. They're burning people at the stake, but they're not really suffering. They just asphyxiate before the flames get to them. I'm like, are you trying that hard to defend what is the indefensible, right? Yeah, it was done out of love.
Yeah, they love it. Yeah.
Well, and if your theology is this person's going to hell, we're just starting the fire now. I mean, I really believe that's how they reason to it. When you believe in people deserve to burn in hell, then how could God be unhappy if we take those heretics and set them on fire? We're doing the work of God. He's going to do that in the afterlife. If that's your theology, it's very consistent. Bankrupt, and then when someone points out it's bankrupt, then we need to say, good point, good skepticism. You're absolutely right. I'm not going to defend or nor try to excuse that. Right? I don't want to oppose, say, well, yeah, Christians have been responsible for a lot of evil in the world, but we built a lot of hospitals too. Like, we've done enough good to outweigh the wars we've started. Don't do that. Don't do that. Right?
Hey, Greg, back to my earlier question, sorry, things down the line now. Seems to me that if you're deconstructing, maybe people that I'm talking are deconstructing and they come to their
Sure.
instead, and we're all, we can't live with that. We have to have. We'll figure out some way to develop.
Well, actually, living with ambiguity is a sign of maturity.
Hard.
Well, it's hard, it's difficult, but it is. I learned that in Psych 101, that living with ambiguity. I remember when wasn't Carl King, it was Faulkner. A lot of you know him. He's teaching at Abilene, and it's in a counseling class, he just said that's a mark of maturity, the ability to live with ambiguity. There you go. It doesn't all have to be worked out.
Come up with a worldview. You're going to come up with something that.
But the worldview may incorporate ambiguity. The actual worldview may be, I don't have all the answers. I don't even have to have all the answers. God has all the answers. I am not God. So I'm comfortable leaving that in his hands. Right. So I'm back to, I don't have to explain. I don't have to win the argument. I don't have to convince you. If you'd encountered me in my 20s, I had to convince you. I had to win the argument. I could not stand the fact that you weren't where I thought you needed to be. And you would have to push me away because I wouldn't let go until I convinced you, right? But that was my own anxiety about not being able to live with ambiguity and not being comfortable with the fact that someone's thinking differently than me. Now, I'll still try and give the reasons why I believe what I believe. But I've let go of trying to say I can't be at peace until you are thinking the way I think you ought to be thinking.
I can't get out of my house. So,
I wonder if Book of Job is a good example of someone's faith
Deconstructing.
deconstructed, and
Yes.
there's everything not to do with this.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at all the arguments that his friends put forward, and that's a perfect example of what not to do when someone's deconstructing. Because all their arguments, well, surely you have sinned, surely there's something you've done to deserve this. It does not win him over. It makes him more and more convinced that they're idiots and they know nothing about what he's experienced, right? So rather than helping him, it's pushing him away. That's why I'm saying, if we want to create space, if you want someone to reconstruct, you have to create the loving, non-judgmental environment where the questions can be asked, where you can affirm the validity of the questions, where we're not defensive, where we don't try and excuse or explain away, where we really, as Jesus would have us, we confess our sins one to another. Yes, we've been guilty of wars, we've been guilty of genocide. And what happened to Native Americans? I think those were Christians coming from Europe that settled these lands. Tell us about their experience. I can't say, well, it wasn't that bad. No, see, I mean, you can't do that. Or if you do that, the person who's skeptical is further entrenched in their skepticism and being convinced the church is clueless, right? One of the things he said is that the church has not shown itself to be an alternative way of living that holds itself accountable. And when we deny what we've actually done, we're not holding ourselves accountable, right? And Jesus would have us confess our sins, but not confess the sins of others. That's the other approach, to say, well, yeah, Christians have done bad things, but look at all the bad things atheists have done. No. Stay out of their eye. You just talk about the log confess the log that's in your eye. Don't try and say, but Pol Pot and these other guys were atheists and they killed. No, it's not a competition of who killed the most. And if we killed less, maybe we're better. See, that kind of reasoning turns people absolutely into agnostics and atheists. All right. We should just say, like Jesus said, talk about what's in your eye. Don't talk about what's in the atheist eye. Talk about what's in your eye. Yes. we've murdered millions, we've created genocide, the Spanish conquistadors asked the Incas and the Aztecs, how did that go? When the people under the banner of the Lord showed up, how did that go for them? Right? Confess all the stuff. The other thing it'll do to the skeptic, all of a sudden, they're expecting you to be defensive. But when you admit everything they're saying and you add to it, oh, you've forgotten about. You listed some, but you know what? There's this and this and this. You forgot all these wars that we're responsible for. And all of a sudden they're like, I wasn't the reaction I was expecting. I was expecting this person to say no, and this person actually joined me and saying yes.
Isn't that being manipulative? I mean,
No,
if I'm actually struggling with that question, I mean, I guess if I'm clear about it and I view it like that, and that agrees with the way I do it, yeah.
I'm not.
But that's a hard conversation when it feels like you're being accused of something that
The other
you're
person's
struggling with
accusing
yourself.
you as
Yeah,
a Christian.
It's like if somebody's saying that to me, I mean, I've had people say that to me, and it feels like initially, and I have to remember, look, it's like, I don't have to be defensive about this.
Right.
This is my, in fact, I struggle with that too, right? I
That's
struggle with the things that Christians have been done or have been accused of, whatever. I mean, the whole Christian community has a pretty bad reputation, right? So
let's just admit it.
yeah, and I struggle with that. Yeah, I mean, sure, there were some terrible things done, but I don't have to necessarily beat them up too. I mean, I don't have to I'll add to the, like.
Well, I would.
Oh, yeah, but, and,
But
it's
I would.
like I'm joining in it's not throwing the stones too. It's like,
No, I'm just admitting the realities rather than concealing it. Rather than
Yeah.
trying to deny it, I'm saying, yes, all these things, and there's even more.
yeah.
Pope Pius had this ambiguous relationship with Hitler. Did the Catholic Church really help any Jews during the Holocaust? The Catholic Church still hasn't released the documents, the papers from Pope Pius's papacy. I wonder why they're still under lock and key. Right? I mean, because they'll find it.
Help the conversation.
Yes, it does.
I mean,
Yes,
if
Yeah.
I'm not, I don't get involved in the conversation on that level.
Okay, but here's what I'm saying. If you're running into someone who's skeptical, then not the way you get credibility is say, yes, I understand that. And I understand even the things that raise all these questions. If that person can see that I deeply understand the objections that are raised, and I think that there are serious, real questions to be asked there, then I become the person that person can discuss it with, because I'm not defensive. I'm actually showing. It's just like I'm saying, the professors did that with me. It was like, you've got questions? Yes, those are good questions. Here's an array of answers, because there's not one clear, definitive answer to such complicated questions. See, all of a sudden, I felt very comfortable talking to the professor, because he didn't claim to have that it was. He's telling me it's a good question. There's not one necessarily only Christian answer to it. So he's inviting me into a safe place where I can discuss. That's what I'm saying to do. I'm just saying,
I agree with you.
in my
You
opinion,
don't.
you win credibility.
Welcome people's questions, comments,
Right.
and whatever they have to share, right?
And do the opposite of what they expect. If they think you're going to be defensive, instead of being defensive, go ahead and help them make the list. Because I'm not, then they're ultimately going to say, well, then why are you a Christian if you know all these things?
The problem.
Guess what? Listen, at that moment, when they say, why are you a Christian then? What have they done? What's happened? The door has opened to, because if you're still a Christian and you know all this stuff, because I watched some YouTube videos and I heard this stuff and I don't think I want to be a Christian anymore, but here you are, know all those YouTube videos and that's real and maybe even more, and you're still a Christian. Now, what have they wanted to do? They want to hear from them. So one of my points is, do not try and respond until invited. If you try and respond before they've asked for your response, they'll push you away. So you just wait until they finally say, so what do you do with all these issues? When I really convinced them, I understand all these, then they say, well, what do you do? Now, guess what? I've been invited into a space. Now they're willing to listen. Because they've invited. Okay, John David got something, Mary got something, Rachel got. And our time's fleeting, so here we go. This is gonna set us up for next week, I think. Okay.
Okay, for next week. We're the one who talks about the song.
Yeah.
Song of orientation. Disorientation. So, I think the feelings that I feel is people are stuck in disorientation. Or deconstruction. It's number one, it's sad. It genuinely is sad. And I think that's one of the reasons why we actually.
Right.
Sad.
Yeah.
I think sad. And so I think what I'm looking for next is. I don't know, not that we can call these people out. Control. We can't turn them against. But. We don't want these people to be stuck in. We want them to be able. Maybe this is how.
We're headed that way. Yeah, we're headed that way, but I agree, we're not there. Right now, we're just trying to revel in the reality of the problem. Because if you go too quickly to the reorder, right? Because Rohr talked about order, disorder, reorder. Same sort of thing, that kind of. It's the with Heidegger's synthesis. There's a thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis. Some time ago, I talked about that. He's a philosopher. Yeah, well, that'd be a good way to put it. Yeah, yeah. So I think to your point is biblically there is an acknowledgement of this process. The scriptures even contain divine record of this progress, of this process. The book of Job, he starts with everything's orderly till everything falls apart, but it gets reordered at the end. But it gets reordered in a way that's really, really not what he started. Right. So we'll get to how does this actually, and I don't want us to think only about how can I help others. I want us to first think of what's in your eye. How can I help me? Because ultimately what you share is your story with others. You don't tell them their story. You say, this is what helped me. I'm not pushing it on you. I'm not requiring it of you. But I know all these issues, and here's how I at least have worked with them. Now they can, I'm not dictating how they ought to work with them. I'm giving them an example of how they might, perhaps they get married, and then we'll come to Rachel.
Raise your hand and go.
Okay,
My
Rachel.
thoughts are all scrambled now.
Sorry, apologies for scrambling.
Been stuck in deconstruction. Like recently. I do have ideas. I think the main thing here is that there's not. We believe all this, but then we have all the answers. And that's it, But I think my question would be, how do we, besides saying, that's a good question. It's okay to not have all the answers. That's the big one for me. How do we create that environment where emulate the asker, where if we are constantly deconstructing, that this is a place where we're doing that publicly a little bit to where it's normalized to ask the difficult questions. We're not just parroting the same answers that we're supposed to parrot, keeping that to ourselves in private. We feel the one with the questions that's finally brave enough to ask it feels the outside.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do we make
Yeah. Okay. Great question. Yeah. So we're going to stop. So but we're talking about creating the space. right? And I think Rachel's hitting it very well. How to create a space where it doesn't seem like you're an outlier for asking a question, but questions are asked. And that's okay, because it's modeled, because people ask questions.
Yeah.
And it's happening all the time. Right? Then we will get to, and I've already suggested that after your non-judgmental listening and you're validating the question, you wait until they invite you into a conversation. When that happens, then I think we can talk about, well, what do you do once you are invited? But that takes some patience, because you got to wait till you're invited. If you jump the gun, you'll shut them down. They'll feel like, I'm not able to ask that question because you're just trying to push back with answers already. And I just hadn't even articulated my question. And I'm just kind of, yeah, Job's friends did great when they sat there the first week and said nothing. When they opened their mouths, it went bad real quick. Job didn't say, so what do you fellas think? He didn't ask. While they were sitting there sharing his suffering, everything was going well. He had people suffering with him. When they started trying to answer, offer answers for his condition, it went bad. That's a good model for us to think about. So I do want to get to what do we do when we're invited, right? Because I think there are things we can do better or worse in those moments. But I think you got to wait till you're invited.
Just go back to Mary, so if no one is
Well, to every rule, there's an exception.
Yeah.
All right, we'll pick it up there.